Hi, I'm Ashley, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this portrait of my daughter. So this video is only going to have the painting portion of this portrait, not the sketch portion, but the painting portion is very detailed, mostly real time, very few parts are sped up, and that will really give you an idea of how long it takes to paint something like this and all of the steps involved. That way you'll feel confident to try it yourself. As far as the sketching goes, you could definitely trace a photograph, you could sketch from a reference photo, or you could try sketching from life. I did this sketch based off of reference photo from my daughter's 4th birthday. And it took me probably about 45 minutes to draw and get all of her features correct. So I'm just gonna jump in and show you how I paint a portrait. Enjoy. I have this sketch of my daughter already done. And then my kneaded eraser is frozen in here. So I gotta get my kneaded eraser out. And I'm just gonna roll my kneaded eraser over the sketch to lighten up these pencil marks. And this is one of the ways that I like to do this because it doesn't take up all of the pencil, it just lightens it, makes it softer. Try not to do that and bend your page. You can also just kind of dab it on there and it lifts up a lot of the pencil. I'm going to leave her facial features a little bit darker because I want those to be more prominent, and I need the darkness, so like inside the mouth it's pretty much, you know, almost black. Same with the eyelashes and even a little bit the irises. They're very dark in the picture because she's not facing us and it's not a close-up of her face, so all of that is very dark. So we'll leave that pretty dark there, and then kind of just soften up the rest of it pretty significantly. All right. And when I was painting something else, I got some green on there, so we'll just, you know, make that work somehow. So now I just need to wake up my paints. Now I just have to decide where to start. I also want to get out metallic paints because her crown is a gold metallic. So I have these metallic paints. They're Caliro. I don't know how to pronounce that, but I think Caliro pearl colors. And they're pretty good. They activate just like watercolor. I mean, they are watercolors, but they activate easily with water, and they're fairly transparent. Okay. So let's start with a soft skin color. So I'm going to switch. I used, this one was a size 16 round. These brush sizes do not seem to be standardized. So this is size 16 is not probably huge compared to a lot of size 16. I would say that's probably more like a size maybe 8 that I've seen in like Princeton and stuff. And then this one says it's a size 2, which is maybe a little larger than that. All right, I'm going to start by mixing up a skin color. I have this kind of soft brown already here, which is pretty close. I think it just needs a little bit of pink to bring it more toward that peachy skin tone. Maybe a little bit of orange. And then just a tad bit of green to mute that just a little bit. So I have no idea what colors those were that I mixed, but basically, because I don't know what was in there before, but basically if you mix like pink and green, you'll get a skin color, and you just vary how much of each of those colors you want based on how warm or cool you want the skin tone. If you want it more olivey, you add more green. If you want it to be more pink, you add more pink. You can add yellow. You can add more brown if you you know, if you have brown and want to make it more brown, you can do that. But just by adding more pigment of pink and green, you can get a darker skin color. So I start my portraits very, very, very pale, and then build up slowly. And just getting those layers in really helps you be able to define exactly where you want the shadows to be. So starting with the arms, just getting that light wash in, but preserving the highlight area. And while it's still wet, I'll just lift some of the pigment out to ensure that that lightness really remains. And after doing the arms, I'm just going to put a light wash over her entire face, and that gives the arms time to dry a little bit before I add another layer to the shadow areas. After adding a new layer of paint, wet on dry, you can use a damp brush to like blend out the edges to prevent any hard edges where you don't want them. And to do this, you just wet the brush, then tap it on a towel and gently touch the edges where you want to blend out. Here you see that I'm gonna actually wet the entire face very gently prior to adding the next layer. This creates that soft blend using the wet on wet technique. And I'm still using the same idea of building up layers of darkness and only introducing the color to the shadowed areas. And basically, even if that layer below was dry, by re-wetting the whole thing evenly, it creates that same wet on wet effect as if that initial layer would have been wet still. The biggest challenge for me with portraits is really patience. I just have to go slow and build up the layers. And I guess you could do more pigmented washes earlier on, but it wouldn't create quite that same effect that building up layers of watercolor has. Do you have anything specific that challenges you when you're painting? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear it. While working on her face, I also began the hair. So around the face, when you're doing a portrait, you really want to connect the hair to the shadowed areas, and connecting those shapes is important to make the portrait look more cohesive. So in this portrait, my daughter's wearing a crown, but she still has some hair showing right under the crown, which I can connect to her face shape. So again, after adding the layer, I can lift out some of the paint to regain that highlight if the paint just kind of bleeds out a little bit too far. After getting some washes in for the skin and hair, I decided to work on the crown. So there's a big contrast between the crown and the hair and skin. And so by getting the colors of the crown down, it can help me determine kind of how dark to go on my daughter's features. So sometimes it's nice to have that contrast already there before you continue to build up the layers. So I mixed up some blues and pinks to paint the ring of flowers around the bottom edge of the crown. And to do the flowers, I basically made just little C marks in different orientations to create that flower shape without having to try really hard to make them like detailed or precise. And after getting the basic shape in, I tap a little bit of the deeper color just to create some contrast. And I did that same thing with 2 different colors of pink. After getting those flowers in, I mixed up some green and using just a tiny bit of pink, which is its contrasting color, to mute it. And that makes it just a more kind of natural green color versus like a super vibrant green. And then I use that green to just create some very simple leaf shapes. So just take my brush and just press down with the tip of the brush, tilt it at different angles to create some tiny leaves. And after getting some color on the crown, I went back into the skin and added another layer of deeper shadows. So always just adding that color to the darkest area in my reference photo first, and then working my way out to the lighter areas. That way I can kind of focus on preserving the lightness and those highlights. Now, at this point, I'm kind of diving into getting a little bit more of painting the details versus just painting the light and dark values. So here I'm trying to add some details kind of between the fingers where it would be the darkest, and kind of some of the creases where her arm is bent. If it gets a little bit too dark or bleeds too much, remember that lifting technique using a damp brush. It's really helpful to kind of control the pigment and the water. Now to add more detail to her facial features. So for this, I'm really just trying to focus on the shapes that I've already created with the sketch. So if that sketch wasn't perfect, that's okay. But I'm not really going to try to change it with the painting because that just really, for me, wouldn't be successful. So the sketch really kind of locks in those features for my style. I'm sure there are some people that can just go in with the paintbrush and tweak things and it'll look realistic and it'll look nice, but that's not me. So really I just followed the sketch and then used the reference photo to determine kind of the shape of the shadowed areas on her face. So now I just need to mix up more paint for the different shades and tones of skin and her facial features and hair. And so I mix up like a darker color and then add water to lighten it. So with watercolor, you don't need to add white to lighten it. The transparency in the white of the paper does that for you. So you just add water to make it more transparent, kind of thin it out. At this point, I'm starting to create more and more detail. So I'm getting the hair color and texture painted in kind of its more final form now. And for this, I use just the very tip of my brush to paint some like wispy lines for her hair. I really love painting hair. It's probably my favorite part of portrait paintings. I love just that little wrist flicking and how it doesn't have to be super precise. I don't know. It's just fun. Now, I don't actually like drawing hair like with ink or pencil for some reason, but painting it, I really do like. So after getting the lighter areas of the hair in, I mix up some of the darker colors again and then add the low lights. So even in blonde hair, you'll get those shadowed areas that are really much darker value. So I just use those same techniques with the darker color and look a little bit at the reference photo to see where the low lights are and the highlights are in the hair, but really just going more off of feel and just kind of vibe, I guess, for this part. So then I repeat the step that I did previously of pre-wetting her face. And after adding the hair, her face just seemed too washed out. So pre-wet and then just added another very light wash to build up that depth a little bit more again. Then I went back to adding some deeper shadows on her arms again as well. So here at this point, I'm just cleaning up the edges and kind of defining them by adding a touch of deeper value to the edges of her face. And this creates the depth and volume, basically, to her face shape. As I watch the video, I feel like these steps can feel pretty redundant and time consuming, but layering is a really good way to go to create a lot of depth and dimension to a painting. So I'm sure, we could start with a deeper value and get there a little bit faster. But creating that layering with the translucent paint of watercolor, it just really creates that depth and dimension to the painting. So at this point, I continue to add that depth and dimension. So now I'm adding kind of more details and still darker values, and adding her mouth and lips with some muted pink. And again, to mute a color to make it more neutral of a color, you can just add the contrasting color. So for pink, the contrasting color is green. So just a touch of green in there mutes it. Then I used this just the smallest amount of black paint to paint her eyes, and added just a touch of blue as well for her irises. And it's really just a hint of color because it's a really small area. So continuing with the facial features and adding kind of the deepest shadows to the nose and mouth areas there. Then I added the deepest shadow shades kind of around the edges of the dress and the unicorn, where those would be casting a shadow onto her skin. And at this point, I feel like the painting is really starting to come together. So you can really see her facial features, which are pretty accurate and well defined. And her skin has light and dark values, giving the illusion of the lighting. And here I just need to add the darkest parts, kind of defining the edges around her fingers. And this arm and hand are definitely the hardest part for me in this painting. Her arm was like squished into the unicorn and her fingers were pushing into it, and that created some kind of interesting shapes and shadows that were a little bit hard to draw and paint, but overall I do feel like it came together pretty well. Now onto the metallic paint for her gold crown. So this is really just like coloring in the crayon, nothing, the crown, nothing super fancy. But I am trying to preserve some areas of highlight and add just a little bit more pigment to the shadowed areas. And after painting the crown, I did decide to lift out a specific highlight because it did feel like too flat, like just too one note. After doing the crown, I added a little bit more detail to her hair with just some more textures, and again, just using that kind of flicking motion with the tip of my brush. So at this point, my daughter is basically done, and now it's time to paint her dress and the unicorn. And so there's lots of soft purples and pinks. So I'm going to start with just mixing up my color, and then I add just a light wash over the entire dress. So at the bottom, I used more of like a flicking motion to create some texture. The bottom half of the dress has like tulle, I think, some different texture of fabric than the top, and this created kind of a different quality. Even though it's the same color, it just has a different texture, so I used a little bit different technique to paint that in. So after getting the wash in and the texture on the bottom, I added the seams at the shoulders to create the texture that I wanted in them. There was like some ruching or something. So it created some shadows. And then it's just about adding layers and more shadows to the dress, just like I did on her skin. At the bottom there are tiers, so I created the like horizontal lines between those tiers just to indicate or give the impression of that. Now onto the unicorn. The purple areas are basically the same color as the dress, but they're a little bit shiny. So I created some more highlights on them where the light is hitting it, and then tapped in some more concentrated color to get the darker values on the shadowed side. Then I mixed up some more colors for the unicorn's mane, which had pinks and blues and purples. And just like I did for her hair, I used that same like flicky motion with my wrist to paint the unicorn hair texture, or the mane texture. So then I decided to try to layer some silver metallic over the purple areas because they were shimmery, and it worked pretty well. The metallic watercolors that I have are a little bit more opaque than typical watercolor paints, but they're still transparent enough that the purple still shows through, and it did create a nice effect. So at this point, I'm not sure why, but I decided to paint the unicorn's face next. And so I did add the mouth and the eyes with my liner brush. Definitely should have done the pink of the unicorn's body and face before adding the features, because doing it this way results in that potential of reactivating those dark colors. Even if I let them dry, can reactivate them and cause them to bleed out. But anyway, I do like how the face turned out. I think it's really cute, so we'll go with it. So then I mixed up some very faint pink for the body and added just a tiny amount of white gouache to make it more opaque, and then a tiny bit of blue to make it lean toward like a purpley pink instead of that bright bubblegum pink. And this mix did create a color that I was happy with. So I started with just a light wash over the entire unicorn first, and then progressed to building up those details. So while the wash is still wet, just dropping in some darker values for the shadows. And that's a good idea because, again, using that wet on wet technique just allows that soft blend and transition between the shadows and the highlights or lighter parts. And here's where I actually realized the mistake that I made by painting the face first. So I had to go around the mouth and the eyes with the pink, which isn't the smartest thing. I don't know, maybe I just got antsy, wanted to paint the face. I don't know. But I made it work. I did go around those features and tried my best not to reactivate the paint. I definitely did get a tiny bit of bleed from the eye, but I was able to lift it back out, so it was okay. Now for the details of the unicorn, I added a shadow color to create creases like in the unicorn where my daughter was pushing into it with her left arm. And then I added shadows and seams based on the reference photo to the remaining areas of the unicorn. Now for the final step, getting rid of that green. So I'm just using a scrubbing technique with a damp brush and then dabbing on a paper towel until it's mostly gone. It is pretty effective to kind of scrub it, reactivate it, get it back out, but it's not awesome on the paper. But it did get rid of the spot, so that was the final touch. We are finally at the end. The total painting time for this was about 1 hour and 20 minutes. In this video, I did speed up just a couple parts, so it was a little shorter than that. But 1 hour and 20 minutes for the painting, about 45 minutes for the sketching, so about 2 hours overall, which I was really happy with. I felt like that was a decent amount of time and didn't take me too long. And I was really happy with the outcome. I really loved this picture of my daughter, so I was happy to be able to capture it and really, I feel like, do it justice with the painting. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something from it. I do hope that at some point you try a portrait painting of your own. It's definitely a fun and interesting challenge. And if you did like this video, please give it a like, comment, and always check out my channel for additional painting content. Have an awesome day.